Greetings, Earthlings! I traveled 47 million light years just to say, welcome to Bishop Long's Paranormal Show, the Sacred Division. Your mission is simple. Subscribe, follow, and tell every human you know, and at least one suspicious-looking neighbor. Mr. Producer is behind the scenes drinking enough apple juice to power this entire broadcast, so you know it's going to be a great show. Now turn the lights off, lock your doors, and let's get spooky.
Got to go, and now we got to push the buttons, and I think we got it all ready to go now. Just behave. Okay, friends, howdy. Hopefully you all, be kind, rewind. I remember those days. People can say whatever they want to. I remember those good old days. I do. Those were the days, weren't they? They really were. Okay, everybody, I'm Bishop Long, and I appreciate you being here. Happy Friday to you. Bam, this week is in. It's in the can, and that is it. We are already on Friday. We're going into the weekend, and man, it's gone fast. I don't care. It just flies by. It does. Well, thank you, Coyote, thank you. Thank you very much. So, they are. So Grayson, they're making new VCRs and tapes again. There was just something special about those Blockbuster. There was something special about that. Okay, everybody, listen, I'm Bishop Long. If you're bored and have nothing else better to do, you can go to my website if you would like to. It's bishopjameslong.com. Information is there. If you really want to check it out, then head on over yonder and hello, Ireland, and just go look at it if you want to. That's a TikTok issue. So if you want to go to my site, bishopjameslong.com, if you want to purchase all the books are over there. Just purchase all of them. Just go ahead and purchase all of them. Purchase every single one of those books. Every one of them. 100% of the profits will go to the MKS Kids Foundation. It's an orphanage that we sponsor. And so they are needing some assistance. So, hey, the books, I think they're pretty decent. And if you go over there and you just go to bishopjameslong.com, click on the books link, and then purchase them. That helps them. Also, if you go to Bishop James Long and go scroll all the way down or in the middle somewhere, you'll see the music. Yep, I wrote them. I own the books. They're copyright. You go to bishopjameslong.com, scroll down, you'll see the music there. So that's available for you to view. And also, if you want to help the MKS Kids Foundation, for those of you who don't know, it is an orphanage that we sponsor. You can go to bishopjameslong.com and click on the fundraiser link. And so there's a lot of information. There's a lot of ways you can help. There's a lot of ways you can assist the MKS, and they would appreciate that, and so would we. Remember, one of the children there, one of the orphan children, her name is Pamela. And she has a pretty large tumor on the side of her face, and our community raised enough money to get that removed. So there's several procedures that she has to do, and of course there's going to be medicine that's going to be required. So we're going to have ongoing help. So again, just go to bishopjameslong.com and click on the fundraiser link, and you can donate directly to them. Please do not donate to me. Donate directly to them. That would be much, much better if you would. Now, if you want to go to the church's site, you can certainly do so as well, usocc.org. So, look, for those of you who are having a cow, once a week for an hour and a half, 90 minutes, I do a presentation on the paranormal. Once a week, 90 minutes. That's it. We're on 6 days a week. He's a Freemason, guys. Actually, maybe, John, you get to know me before you judge. But that would be a polite thing to do because I've never, ever been a Freemason in my entire life. See, that's the problem, John. Why do you do that? I don't know why people do that. The judging is so stupid. It is childish. It's ignorant, and it makes you look like a complete buffoon. Never been a Freemason. I've never even walked into a Freemason building. So, nice try, John Doe. Anyway, so you got your attention. Congratulations. Yeah. Nonetheless, but if you want to, you can certainly do so, and check the MKS out. That would be wonderful. Now, we're going to have a very interesting presentation tonight. So 90 minutes, that's it, on Friday nights, 90 minutes. We are going to do a presentation on, we usually do paranormal. Right. So, okay, all right, John Doe, here, we'll block you with your one following. There, you got your attention that you needed. There you go, John Doe. Congratulations. Yay, John Doe got blocked. Yay. Yay, John Doe. Okay. All right. Anyway, it's always on TikTok. It's never, well, thank you. Thank you very much. It's never anywhere else. Never anywhere else. It's only on TikTok that this nonsense happens. All right. So right now I have chat on for everybody. And then everybody sends me a hateful message saying I'm a fake bishop because I have put sub chat on. I put sub chat on because we don't want people who are mental midgets coming in here and harassing us. So nonetheless, just if you're going to be rude, I'm going to put sub chat on. And that's just all there is to it, you know. So, all right, just grow up. I mean, really, Mr. Producer, there's got to be something on Netflix that these people can watch. Maybe go watch a documentary. And you might learn something. That'd be pretty good. Yeah, pretty good. All right. I tell you what. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm not a Freemason. I know people who are Freemasons, but I'm not one. And I guess if people are Freemasons, that's wonderful. Congratulations. Okay. So for those of you who are new, because there's quite a few people who are, I really don't get into presentations or conversations because I'm doing a presentation. We teach on something about the paranormal. That's what we do on Friday nights. I don't just look at the computer and say, okay, now entertain me. So what I do is I present something because we are intellectuals here. We are individuals who enjoy using our brains and learning about new things. And that's what we do. That's our community. So if you're looking for a Jerry Springer show, you might want to scroll on because this is not the place for you. This is not the place for you. All right, let's go because we got a lot to go over. And I tell you, this is a crazy, crazy, crazy presentation. Moderators, just let me know if it gets dumb and if it gets rude. I'll just put sub chat on. We'll be done with it. I mean, really, it just let me know. Okay. So. All right, so we'll get to questions, guys, later on. Let me do the presentation. I really feel like I'm going to turn the chat off on TikTok because people just... All right. It's always TikTok. Let's go. Yep, there's the music. There's the music. Yeah. Oh, you do, and you do enjoy it being open for everyone? All right. Just let me know if it gets crazy. All right, everybody, let's go. Today, we're going to talk about a topic that is fascinating. That is the Dodleston Messages. Let's start. Did a computer in 1980s England begin communicating with the year 1541. So there are haunted houses. There are stories about people hearing footsteps in empty rooms, seeing figures standing at the end of hallways, finding doors open that they know that they closed. And after doing paranormal work for as long as I have, for 35 years, I can tell you that those are the stories most of us expect. A haunting belongs to a place. A ghost belongs to the past. The living are here. The dead, they're somewhere else. And occasionally, according to people who believe in these things, something crosses that boundary. But tonight, I'm going to tell you about a case where that explanation doesn't really work. And moderators, do me a favor. You can answer the questions if you wish. I will not even look at the chat on TikTok. Because what happened in a small English village during the 1980s wasn't simply a story that you about somebody claiming that a dead person was communicating with them. The person supposedly communicating with them didn't seem to know that he was dead. In fact, from his perspective, he wasn't. He believed he was alive. He believed he was sitting inside his own home. And according to the messages, the year was somewhere around 1541, more than 400 years away from the people receiving them. Somehow, two groups of people who may have occupied roughly the same geographical location centuries apart allegedly began talking to one another, not through a seance, not through a Ouija board, not through automatic writing, not through a psychic medium. They supposedly communicated through something that in the 1980s was still relatively new to most households if you had one, a computer. In the 1980s, I was around. I remember those days. A lot of people didn't have computers back in those days because they were expensive. And before tonight is over, that computer will no longer be the strangest part of the story, because eventually another presence allegedly enters the conversation. Something that appears to know about both sides. So, something that seems to understand what's happening better than either of them. Something identified by a number, 2109. And once 2109 appears, the story changes. Because now we're no longer asking whether someone in the 20th century was somehow communicating with someone in the 16th century. We have to ask a much stranger question. Was somebody else watching the conversation? And if so, from when? Tonight, we're going to talk about the Dodleston, England. We're going inside an old cottage. We're going to sit down in front of an early home computer, and we're going to follow one of the strangest alleged paranormal correspondents I have ever encountered. But I want to establish something before we begin. I'm not going to tell you this story that it has been proven, because it hasn't. There are skeptics who believe this entire thing was an elaborate hoax. There are legitimate questions about who had access to the computer. There are questions about the language used in the messages. There are theories involving friends, coworkers, practical jokes, psychological phenomena known as and deliberate fabrication. All right. We're going to talk about all that because I don't think paranormal stories become weaker when we ask difficult questions. I think they become more interesting. So I'm not going to ask you to believe this story necessarily. I am going to ask you to listen to it. And then when we get to the end, you can decide what you think happened. Because if this was a hoax, it was an extraordinarily elaborate one. And if it wasn't, then I don't know exactly what category we put it in. A haunting, a time slip, psychokinesis, some bizarre interaction between conscious and technology. I mean, we don't know. And that's where we're going tonight. And it begins in a village called Dodleston. Dodleston is in Cheshire, England. It's not far from the Welsh border and the historic city of Chester. That's important because when you hear the story that we're about to discuss, it's tempting to imagine some enormous Gothic mansion sitting alone on a hill. That's not what we're dealing with. This was village life. Old buildings, roads, property boundaries, places where generations of people have lived on the same piece of land for hundreds of years. That's something Americans sometimes have difficulty maybe appreciating, because here in the States, we consider a building from the 1700s extremely old. In parts of Britain, you can walk into a building and realize that people were living their lives there centuries before the United States even existed. People were born there, got married there, became sick, people died. Then somebody else moved in generation after generation. The landscape remains while the people change. Thank you. So keep that thought in mind because it becomes important later. So in the early 1980s, Ken Webster and his girlfriend Debbie moved into an old cottage in Dodleston. Ken was an economics teacher. Nothing about what happened next apparently began with an attempt to contact spirits. That's one of the details I find very interesting about this case. Nobody was sitting around saying, let's see if this house is haunted. There wasn't a seance. There was no occult ritual. He was not a paranormal fan at all. They were renovating the cottage, and anyone who's ever renovated an old house knows that sometimes you discover pieces of the people that lived there before you. Old wallpaper, covered fireplaces, names carved in wood, coins, newspapers, etc. And occasionally those discoveries can feel strangely intimate. You're standing in your house, but you're holding something that belonged to someone else, maybe a century earlier. So Ken and Debbie, they were working on their cottage when strange things reportedly began happening. At first, they weren't dramatic. Objects seemed to move. Things weren't necessarily where people remembered leaving them. This happens quite often. Paranormal activity does occur many times when you move into a location, you begin renovating it. There's a lot of theories as to why. And if you've ever investigated an alleged paranormal activity, you know that's the kind of thing you got to be careful with. Now, one person moves something, it doesn't tell another person. Okay, memory isn't perfect. Thank you. So one strange occurrence doesn't establish anything. Two strange occurrences doesn't establish anything. But eventually, the incidents became difficult for them to dismiss. One of the better known early incidents involved objects being stacked or arranged. And there were disturbances around the house that began creating the impression that something unusual might be happening. Now, right here, we have our first fork in the road. If you're a believer, you might say, well, poltergeist activity. If you're skeptical, you might say people living in an old house, misinterpreting events. Okay. But this is where things become different. To understand why the computer matters, we need to go back mentally. And for those of you who weren't there at that time, I was, to 1984, 1985. Today, we carry devices around in our pockets that can instantly communicate with someone on the other side of the planet. We have smartphones, Wi-Fi, cloud storage, AI, instant messages, video calls, remote access. If strange words appeared on your computer today, you first probably thought it wouldn't be, your first thought wouldn't be, well, this is from a 16th century person. You'd think I've been hacked. You might be right. But remember, this was in the mid-1980s. And Ken had access to a BBC microcomputer. For those who don't remember those, the BBC Micro, it was an important computer in the British education during the 1980s. And the machine in the story was nothing like the computer that you're using right now. There was no modern internet connection, no Wi-Fi, no cloud account. No stranger halfway across the world can log into your computer through remote access. It didn't exist. Now, technologically speaking, we're dealing with a very different environment. So Ken used the word processing software, and then something happened. A message appeared. A message Ken said that he did not write. Now, I remember those word processors. They were great. You would type, and push enter, and then it would just, man, it would be the greatest thing in the world. You sit down on your computer, you open your word processor, and there's writing there. Not random characters, not corrupted data, words. Someone has written something. Now, your immediate reaction would probably be annoyance. It could be like, who used my computer? Because there's no way that those little computers at that time, those word processors, they wouldn't just type on their own. There's no way. I've had them. I remember them just like it was yesterday. So it's not like a computer that is today. Again, these are something you couldn't hack. There's nothing to hack into. There's no Wi-Fi. So there's no way someone from a different country or even the next door neighbor could have hacked in. Not in 1984, 85. So your first thought, no question, if I sit down in front of this word processor and I see something typed out, I'm going to think, okay, who is using my word processor? But then another message comes, and then another, and eventually it becomes apparent that whoever is supposedly writing these messages is claiming something impossible. The person on the other end doesn't seem to understand what a computer is. He doesn't understand what Ken is. He doesn't understand what's happening. And eventually, the correspondence develops into something resembling a conversation. The alleged communicator identifies himself using the name Lucas. And later, another identity becomes important, Thomas Harden. or variations of that name depending on the account and spelling. But initially, think of him simply as Lucas, as communicating with Ken in 1984, 1985. Lucas appears to believe Ken is the strange one. That's something about this story that genuinely changes the atmosphere. Because imagine a traditional ghost story. Usually the living person is terrified of the ghost. But what happens if the ghost is terrified of you? It reminds me of the movie The Others. Imagine if you're living in England during the reign of Henry VIII. Electricity doesn't exist in your world. Computers don't exist. Modern science doesn't exist. The social religious world around you is radically different. And suddenly, something begins communicating with you. Something claiming to be living in the same place. Something using words and concepts you don't understand. Something claiming to exist centuries in the future. So from Lucas's perspective, if the messages are genuine, Ken Webster is the ghost. See, we automatically place ourselves in the present because that's how consciousness works. And I'll get to your questions later, guys. I'm doing this lecture because I have about 95 pages worth of notes. And I'll never get through it if I don't. So we'll get to your questions later. Now, the moments, I think this moment feels like the center of reality. The year 2026 feels like now. 1541 feels like history. 1985 feels like history. 2109 feels like the future. But those labels exist because of where we're standing. Okay, so as the communication allegedly continued, Lucas tried to understand the people contacting him, and Ken tried to understand Lucas. And gradually, according to the story, information began emerging that seemed to place Lucas somewhere in the 16th century. I already know what you're going to ask, and we'll get to that. And this is where the case starts to becoming more complicated than somebody typing "I'm a ghost," because the language itself was unusual. The spelling was inconsistent by modern standards. The vocabulary was strange. The grammar appeared archaic. Now be careful. You'll sometimes hear people say that experts definitely authenticated the language as genuine 16th century English. And some people actually believe this. There has been some disagreement over the linguistic evidence, but we'll examine that later. But from Ken's perspective, at that time, the language seemed sufficiently unusual. And Lucas apparently didn't communicate like someone pretending to be a stereotypical ghost. He had opinions. He became irritated. He became confused. He asked questions. Became suspicious. Even at times, he seemed frightened. And most importantly, he seemed to possess his own life outside the communication. Now, if this was fiction, someone wasn't simply inventing a ghost. They were creating a character who believed he was a living human being. Now, imagine trying to fake that yourself. You don't simply write, "I am Thomas. I lived here in 1541. Now you have to become Thomas. You have to understand his worldview. You have to answer questions. You have to keep historical references correct. Now, could somebody do that? Well, perhaps. Novelists do versions of it all the time, but now imagine doing it interactively. Someone asks you an unexpected question. You have to answer as Thomas. So they challenge something you've said. You have to explain it as Thomas. They give you information about the world. Again, you have to explain what Thomas would understand. So the game becomes much more dangerous because every historical claim becomes something that might eventually be checked. That's where Ken and others reportedly began verifying the details. And this is also where the alleged person on the other side began becoming more real to them. Lucas wasn't merely a mysterious writer anymore. He was becoming a person. And I think that's where the psychological power of the case begins. Now, certainly in Lucas's time, there were no computers. We'll address that. See, once you start caring about someone, skepticism becomes more difficult. You stop asking who is typing these messages, and you start asking, what is happening to Lucas? Now, the box of lights. Thank you. Let's talk about this. So we come to one of the strangest elements of this story, because apparently Ken's computer wasn't the only impossible object involved. According to the communications, Lucas had his own way of seeing the messages. So that's how he communicated. He describes something that has been translated or interpreted as a box of lights. Sometimes you'll see the phrase rendered in strange, archaic spelling. But the basic idea is extraordinary. Lucas seemed to describe some kind of device, a device he didn't understand, something through which messages could appear. I got to stop there. Because if the story were simply a ghost type messages into a computer, we could place it loosely into the category sometimes called instrumental transcommunication, alleged communication with spirits through electronic devices. But Lucas isn't supposedly dead and operating Ken's computer from the spirit world. Lucas appears to be receiving communication on his side as well. So now we have two terminals, one in the 1980s and one supposedly in the 1500s. And that creates an obvious question. Where did Lucas get his? According to the story, it was given or made available to him by another mysterious figure, a figure sometimes referred to simply as One, O-N-E. Suddenly, the story has another layer. Ken didn't build a time machine. Lucas didn't build a time machine. Neither of them understand why this is happening, but apparently someone else does. Somebody has facilitated the communication. Now think about how unsettling that is. Imagine that tonight after this show, you walk into your bedroom, sitting on a bed is a device you've never seen before. No brand, no instructions, nothing makes sense. You touch it, words appear. Someone begins communicating with you. They claim they live in your house, but they tell you that the year is 2478. You wouldn't immediately think, oh, wonderful, a person from the future. You'd probably think someone had entered your home. You'd wonder who put the device there. You'd wonder, are you being watched? Who gave me this thing? Lucas apparently had essentially the same problem. And the only answer, his answer made things even stranger. The mysterious figure associated with the device did not seem to belong naturally to Lucas's world. Now we're moving away from a simple haunting. Someone appears to be standing between the two time periods. And then something else begins communicating with Ken, not Lucas. Something different. Something that appears far more knowledgeable. Something that appears to understand the experiment. Something that doesn't write like Lucas. And it identifies itself with 4 numbers, 2109. Now, this is the moment where I think the Dodleston Messages stop being a strange ghost story and become something genuinely difficult to categorize, because Ken and the others reportedly began receiving communication with 2109. Now, there's a common misunderstanding I got to correct here. People often say they receive messages from people living in the year 2109. But that's not what the material establishes. The communicators used or signed with 2109. That doesn't mean that's a calendar year. And that distinction is important because whatever 2109 supposedly was, it seems to possess information that neither Ken nor Lucas possessed. It seemed to understand the communication. It seemed to understand time differently. And it also seemed to believe that Ken, Debbie, and others involved were participating in something larger than they realized. Now imagine being Ken, the man that you've been communicating with from the 16th century. That's strange enough. But now you've begun to understand him, his personality, his fears. You can almost place him into a category. Now listen to this. Then another intelligence enters the conversation. And this one doesn't seem confused. That's the frightening part. Lucas is confused. Ken is confused. 2109 is not. Now, if you're in a situation that you don't understand, the most frightening person in the room is often the person who does. The communications attributed to 2109 became philosophical, scientific, sometimes cryptic, sometimes threatening. So they discuss concepts involving time, causality, reality, the nature of the experiment, and at points, they seemed frustrated with Ken. They warned about interference. because they suggested that too much information could create problems. They appeared concerned about what Ken might discover. Now, we're going to get much deeper into those messages because there are some extraordinary claims involving dimensions and the nature of time. But before we do that, I want you to recognize what's happened structurally. So we began with an old cottage. Objects began to move. Writing appeared on a computer. Then a man, apparently living 4 centuries early, began communicating with you in the 1984-85. Then we learned that he supposedly had a mysterious device on his side. Then we learned that someone may have given him that device, 2109, and now another intelligence has entered the conversation and appears to be monitoring both sides. That's escalation. And this is where I would have become extremely uncomfortable, because there's a difference between discovering something and being selected by something. So if Ken simply stumbled on a strange communication, that's one thing. But if someone deliberately connected Ken and Lucas together, why? Why those two people? Why that house? Why the 2 periods of history? See, these are the questions that are strange, because if 2109 had the ability to facilitate communication across time, then presumably it possessed capabilities far beyond Ken's. So why communicate in riddles? Why involve ordinary people? Why not explain everything? Unless explanation was not the objective. Maybe observation was. Maybe Ken and Lucas weren't the researchers. Maybe they were the experiment. Now, I want to change perspective here for a second, for just a few minutes, because I think this is where the story becomes genuinely frightening, if that's not frightening enough. So let's forget Ken Webster for a second. Forget computers, forget the 1980s. Put yourself in England around 1541. King Henry VIII, he's on the throne. England has undergone enormous religious upheaval. The monasteries have been dissolved. Relationship between church and crown has been transformed. Religious beliefs can have now political consequences. People can get themselves into some serious trouble over what they believe and what they say. This isn't an age where you casually tell your neighbors, by the way, a glowing box in my house allows me to communicate with people 400 years in the future. Think about how that sounds in the 16th century, let alone today. So if your neighbor told you that today, you'd probably be concerned about them. Now place that claim in Tudor England. So Lucas reportedly became afraid of how people around him might interpret what's happening, rightfully so. Because from their perspective, this wasn't technology. There's no conceptual framework for this. A box displaying messages from unseen people, knowledge arriving from invisible sources, communication with people who cannot be physically present. No. This was magic. This would be considered sorcery, witchcraft, demonic communication. Suddenly, what feels like a fascinating mystery to Ken could be potentially deadly to Lucas. And that's when the story takes on a different emotional tone. Because Ken can turn the computer off. Lucas may not be able to turn off the consequences. And according to the communication, the situation eventually attracted unwanted attention. Lucas allegedly found himself under suspicion. And the people around him didn't understand what he was doing. How could they? If someone living in 1541 actually possessed an object connected to another century, there would be no safe explanation for it. I mean, he'd say it's not witchcraft, it's telecommunications. What's telecommunication? Communication over distance. With whom? People who have not been born. That probably isn't going to improve your situation. And this is one reason I find the Dodleston story more interesting than a conventional time travel story. See, in movies, somebody travels into the past carrying an iPhone and everyone is amazed. In reality, advanced technology appearing centuries before its time could be terrifying. Matter of fact, Arthur C. Clarke famously observed that sufficiently advanced technology would be indistinguishable from magic. Now imagine the social consequences of possessing that magic in an era when supernatural explanations, it was deeply into people's understanding of the world. Lucas wasn't simply dealing with an impossible device. He may have been dealing with something that could destroy his life. And eventually, according to the story, authorities became involved. Now, before we get to what allegedly happened to Lucas, I wanted to discuss the concept that gives Ken Webster's book its title, The Vertical Plane. Normally, we imagine time horizontally, past, present, future, a line. 1541 is behind us. 1985 is behind us. 2026 is now. 2109 is ahead. And we move along that line in one direction. At least that's how human experience feels. But what if that isn't what time actually is? Physics already gives us reason to be cautious about treating time as some universal cosmic clock ticking identically for everyone. So relativity changed that picture dramatically. Time is connected with space. Motion matters. Gravity matters. There isn't a single universal now functioning exactly the same way ordinary intuition suggests. Now, this doesn't prove the Dodleston Messages, not remotely, but it does remind us that our everyday experience of time is not necessarily a complete description of reality. Imagine another possibility. What if different moments don't disappear? What if 1541 still exists in some sense? Perhaps maybe in another dimension. What if 1985 still exists in some other dimension? What if this exact moment exists as part of a larger structure? There's a theory that there's parallel universes. So in these parallel universes, it is 1541. In these other parallel universes, it's 1985. And then a time machine might not require physically traveling anywhere. Maybe the strange thing would be communication. Pretty interesting if you think about it. So, now, as if that wasn't crazy enough, it seems to be a part of a conceptual theory, if you will. If you want a visual image for tonight, imagine an enormous building. Every floor is a different century. You live on one floor. You assume the other floors are gone because you can't see them. But they're not gone. They're simply above and below you. Then one night, a telephone rings. Someone 400 floors below you has dialed your room. You answer. Neither of you understands how the call connected. Then a third voice enters the line and says, "We've been listening to both of you." That is essentially where we are in this story. And according to Ken, things were about to become even more disturbing. So Debbie now becomes extremely important. That's Ken's wife, because the phenomena apparently wasn't confined to the computer. She began having unusual dreams. Now, dreams are difficult evidence. Let's be clear about that. People dream. Dreams incorporate fear, conversations, memories, expectations. If you spent your day discussing a mysterious 16th century man named Lucas, it would not be remotely surprising to dream about him. That's a rational explanation. But according to the story, Debbie's dreams appeared to intersect with the communications. She reportedly experienced vivid dreams involving Lucas. And Lucas apparently communicated information suggesting awareness of encounters resembling what Debbie had experienced in those dreams. Now we have another problem. Because if that is accurate, the computer isn't the bridge anymore. Consciousness is. And I find that much more disturbing. You can unplug a computer. You can't unplug a dream. Imagine going to sleep after receiving messages from someone who claims to be living 400 years earlier. You close your eyes and suddenly you're somewhere else. Maybe it's just a dream. It probably is. But then the next day, guess what? You receive a message from who? Lucas. Telling you what happened in your dream. Oh. Now it gets interesting, doesn't it? Now, many people would argue that could be remote viewing. Did you unconsciously create the connection? Did somebody with knowledge of your dream fabricate the message, or did something happen while you were asleep? Because the Dodleston Messages increasingly blur boundaries, past and present, dream, waking reality, physical disturbances, electronic communication. So they're no longer standing outside observing it. Their expectations matter, their fear matters, dream matters, relationship matters. Now, from a paranormal perspective, some researchers would argue that consciousness itself may be involved in whatever is occurring. Either way, the story has moved beyond a computer. Then came another development. Now, well, Adam, I'll answer that question because one night a week for 90 minutes, we actually talk the paranormal. That's it, because I've been in the paranormal field for 35 years. We are here 6 days a week. I've never seen you here. We have Bible studies on Sundays and Wednesdays. We have night prayer on Sunday and Friday. I've never seen you here. So 6 days a week, we devote to theology. 1 day a week for 90 minutes. We have fun. We talk about the paranormal. Let's drink a wine cooler and relax. Okay. Now came another development. Listen to this. The identity of Lucas began to change. And according to the account, Lucas wasn't necessarily his real name. Eventually, a name emerged, Tom Harden. Now, you'll encounter variations in spelling of this case. That's not automatically suspicious. I mean, who cares? But the revelation of his identity reportedly created a serious reaction from 2109. Remember, that's another person that's monitoring the conversation. That's one of those moments where if the story happened as described, I would want to know why, because 2109 seemed alarmed. The communication suggested that learning too much about Lucas's identity had created a problem. And think about what that implies. If you're communicating with someone in the past and you discover who that person actually is, well, you can research them. You look for records, you investigate the property, parish records, legal records, genealogical information, historical documents. Suddenly the person isn't protected by an anonymous name like Lucas. Now you have a name. And there's an obvious paradox. Suppose Thomas tells Ken something in 1541. So again, for those of you keep in mind, Lucas, his name is Thomas Harden. Okay. Now let's keep going because this is interesting. All right. And that changes everything. Because I've lost my point here. Hold on 1 second. So 2109 was concerned. Very, very concerned. There were warnings, there were restrictions, there were suggestions that certain information should not cross the boundary. And at one point, the communication associated with 2109 became much less friendly. That changes everything because up until this point, you might imagine 2109 as a scientist, observer, maybe future humans, I don't know. But now their behavior raises another possibility, control. They don't simply want to observe communication. They want to control what information moves through it. And that's when I began asking a darker question. What exactly are they protecting? History, Ken, Thomas, who's Lucas, the experiment themselves? So the communication attributed to 2109 reportedly became increasingly stern. Now, the basic message was that Ken and others were interfering with something they didn't understand. They were pushing too far, learning things they weren't supposed to know. And 2109 suggested that consequences could follow. Now, again, if you're skeptical, this is exactly the kind of dramatic escalation a storyteller might introduce. First, there's a mystery and a character, and there's a larger conspiracy. Then there are warnings. It looks beautifully, maybe too beautifully, but keep that in mind. But if you're evaluating the claims from inside the story, imagine the psychological effect. You're already experiencing strange events in your home. You're receiving messages apparently connected to another century. Your girlfriend is having dreams connected to the person sending the messages. And now another intelligence tells you that you're interfering with an experiment and essentially warns you to knock it off. What do you do? And moderators, just remind people, just remind people to have a wine cooler, relax. We only talk paranormal for 90 minutes a week. So what would you do? most sensible people would stop. But human beings, we're curious. Tell someone there's a locked door and they may ignore it, and tell them there's absolutely forbidden from opening the locked door, and suddenly that door becomes very interesting. Ken wanted answers. Who was Lucas? What was 2109? How were the messages appearing? Why did any of this have to do with the disturbances of the house? Could the communications be tested? Could historical information prove that Thomas Lucas existed? And the deeper they went, the more tangled everything became, because apparently something else had been happening in the cottage, something much more familiar to paranormal investigators, poltergeist activity. And 2109 appeared to know about that too. According to Ken's account, the communications connected the strange physical disturbances with a larger phenomenon. Now think about what that means. If you accept the story at face value, the moving objects weren't a separate haunting. The computer messages, it wasn't a separate phenomenon. The dreams weren't separate. The 16th century communicator was not separate. They may have all been manifestations of the same underlying event. And that possibility is much more unsettling than a ghost, because a ghost is something we at least have a culture vocabulary for. This we don't. And this, my friends, is where I want to leave you for a moment before we go deeper, because we're approaching the part of the story where Thomas's situation becomes dangerous. Thomas is Lucas, remember, and another supposed communicator appears. Historical research begins colliding with the messages, and 2109 starts making claims about the structure of reality itself. Now, before we continue, let's consider this possibility. Maybe the fundamental assumption behind every ghost story is wrong. We think ghosts come from the past into the present. Why? Because we assume the past is gone. But suppose it isn't. Suppose every moment exists somewhere within the structure of space-time. Suppose consciousness normally experiences those moments sequentially. And suppose even under extremely rare circumstances, information leaks between them. In other words, the parallel universes. Then perhaps nobody in Dodleston was communicating with the dead at all. Maybe two groups of living people were experiencing each other simultaneously. Thomas wasn't reaching forward. Ken wasn't reaching backward. Maybe both were simply standing in the same place at different coordinates and time, and something created a hole between them. If that's what's happened, then the cottage itself becomes fascinating. Because imagine standing in Ken's kitchen in 1985. Now imagine Thomas standing in approximately the same geographical location in 1541. Same earth beneath them, same piece of land, 4 centuries apart. Neither can see each other, they can't hear each other, but somehow words cross the boundary. And if the boundary can be crossed by words, what else can cross it? A thought, a dream, an object, a person? And that's where the Dodleston messages become frightening, because the real mystery isn't that someone supposedly communicated across 400 years. Well, that's crazy enough. The real mystery is who opened the connection. Because Ken apparently didn't, Thomas didn't, but someone, something, seems to have known that they were both there, and whatever 2109 was is watching. And when Ken and his friends started discovering information they weren't supposed to know, it wanted them to stop, but they didn't. And according to the story, Thomas Lucas was about to pay a very real price for what's happening. Remember, Thomas is Lucas, and he's in the Henry VIII time, because in his world, communicating with invisible people, that wasn't considered an interesting paranormal experiment. It could be considered something much more dangerous. You could be arrested, destroy your reputation. And in England, under Henry VIII, you could be unalived. And that's where the story becomes darker. Because soon, another person allegedly begins communicating through the impossible connection. I hope you're writing this down, because let me tell you, now we have another communicator. Not Ken, not Thomas, not 2109. We have a puzzle that we got to make. There you go, TikTok. So This person is not Ken, it's not Thomas, it's not 2109. A man claiming to be an authority in Thomas's world. In Henry VIII's world now. And what he has to say makes it appear that whatever was happening in the cottage was no longer a secret. Someone in 1541 had noticed, and Thomas Hardin Lucas was in trouble. Remember, Thomas is living in 1541, and that gives the foundation without rushing the best material. Listen, this is crazy, because we're going to now talk about Thomas's alleged arrest. There's a mysterious sheriff, the escalating intervention of 2109 attempts to verify Thomas historically. It gets even crazier. So, well, because you got to keep in mind, this is, it was considered witchcraft. This is in 1541. So this was a different world. So in this time, you're communicating with somebody you can't see or hear. They're going to think that's witchcraft. So this is where, look, we got Thomas Hardin. He was a man living in Tudor England in 1541, a man communicating with people who wouldn't even be born for 400 years later. And now someone in his own time have noticed what he's doing. And if you ever wondered what might actually happen if you traveled into the past and showed someone modern technology, forget the movies for a moment, because we usually imagine people being amazed. They're showing them photographs, electric lights, television, smartphone. Everybody gathers around and, oh, that's wonderful. But depending on where and when you are, well, that might be a different situation. They may become afraid of you. Frightened people can become dangerous very quickly. Accuse you of witchcraft. And Thomas apparently found himself in exactly that situation. Remember what he supposedly possessed, some kind of strange device through which writing appeared. He couldn't properly explain where it came from. He couldn't explain how it worked. He couldn't explain the people communicating through it. What was he supposed to say? Oh, don't worry, they're school teachers from the 20th century. Because now imagine the obvious follow-up question. What's the 20th century? And Thomas would have to explain that he was communicating with people living hundreds of years after everyone around him was dead. That's not a conversation that you'd want to have in Tudor England. And according to the messages, Thomas was becoming increasingly nervous. He understood something Ken could not fully appreciate. For Ken, this was a mystery. For Thomas, this was an accusation. And eventually, according to Ken's account, someone else appeared through the communication. Someone apparently connected to authority in Thomas's world, a man generally described in retellings of the case as a sheriff or an official. Now, I got to be careful with terminology, because the surviving story has been retold so many times that details are sometimes presented more confidently than others. Look, the important point is this. Someone claiming to belong to Thomas's period apparently communicated through the same strange system. And that person wanted answers. Who was Ken? What was happening? What was Thomas involved with? Now imagine Ken sitting reading this, and up until this point, Thomas has been something almost abstract, a historical mystery. But now another person from Thomas's world appears. Suddenly, Thomas, Lucas, his world feels kind of populated. There's authorities, neighbors, consequences. Thomas isn't simply a voice coming out of history anymore. He's a man living inside a society. That society seems like it's closing in and around him. Now think about the situation Ken is in. Suppose Thomas tells Ken, I'm being questioned. Ken has something Thomas doesn't, history. Ken can potentially research what happened next. It's an extraordinary advantage. Imagine being able to look up tomorrow before tomorrow happens. But it's also incredibly dangerous. Because what happens if Ken discovers that Thomas was arrested or unalive, disappeared? Does he tell him? Imagine receiving a message tonight from someone claiming to live in 2468. And you've been talking for months. You started to trust this person. And then one night they say, we found your name in our historical records. And you ask, well, what does it say? Silence. You ask again, nothing. And finally, the answer, I don't think I should tell you. Tell me what? Imagine the fear that would create, because immediately you know something was wrong. You wouldn't even need the answer. their refusal would become the answer. That's the nightmare buried inside the communication with the future. See, people always imagine asking for lottery numbers, stock prices, technology, who becomes president, wins the World Series. But there's another question, one you might regret asking: when do I pass away? And if someone from the future knows your name, maybe they can find that out. Maybe they already have. Now imagine Thomas, Lucas, realizing that Ken lives in a world where Thomas's entire life is ancient history. Every decision Thomas is about to make has already happened from Ken's perspective. His children, if he has them, his enemies, success, failures, death, all of it. So Thomas is experiencing uncertainty. Ken is living 4 centuries after the answer. That creates an enormous imbalance between them. Unless, of course, the future isn't fixed. And that's apparently where 2109 becomes important, because the communications attributed to 2109 suggested that information couldn't simply be transferred carelessly. There were consequences, restrictions, rules. And Ken didn't know what those rules were. He was learning them by breaking them. This is one of those, 2109 doesn't sound like Thomas. And that's one of the things that makes the story so interesting. So the alleged communication from Thomas, Lucas, and the communication associated with 2109 did not present themselves in the same way. Thomas appeared human, emotional, confused, sometimes angry or frightened. He seemed to be struggling to understand what was happening, but 2109 was different. Thank you. The tone was different. Knowledge was different. The attitude. 2109 seemed detached, really, almost clinical. And above it all, it seemed to understand the situation. And I think that matters. Because if you're looking at this skeptically, you have to ask whether one person was creating multiple characters. If so, who created the material? I mean, whoever created the material understood something about storytelling. Thomas gives an emotional investment. 2109 gives us mystery. Thomas asks questions. 2109 gives cryptic answers. And there's another possibility. I mean, if communications were genuine, then we're dealing with two fundamentally different sources. One appears to be human from the past. The other, we don't know. Now, I got to emphasize something. The designation 2109 is often casually treated as though it simply means the year 2109. That has not been established. It could be an identifier. It may mean something else entirely different. We don't know. Because if someone says, I'm writing to you from the year 2109, at least you know what they're claiming. But if someone identifies themselves as 2109, are we talking about a person, a group, a project, a computer, AI? And apparently Ken wasn't given straightforward answers. So, and by the way, and I think it's important to note, inside the communications move toward concepts involving time itself. Talks about the vertical plane. That's where the title of Ken's book becomes important, the vertical plane. So Ken wrote a book about this called The Vertical Plane. And you got to think about that. The way we normally imagine time, a line, yesterday behind us, tomorrow ahead. But imagine that line is only how we experience something much larger. Think about a book. When you're reading page 200, page 100 feels like the past. And page 300 feels like the future. But here's the strange thing. They're all physically inside the book at the same time. Page 100 didn't disappear because you've reached page 200. Page 300 isn't non-existent because you haven't read it yet. They're all there. So your experience moves through them sequentially. You go one at a time. Now imagine consciousness works something like that. Now, maybe these aren't places that vanish and appear. Maybe they're pages. Perhaps consciousness normally reads them one at a time. If something allowed information to move vertically through those pages, you would get something resembling the Dodleston Messages. Thomas isn't dead. Ken isn't communicating with a ghost. They're both alive, just not on the same page. And somehow, someone punched a hole through the book. And here's where I find the story genuinely unsettling, as if it's not already. Because if that's what's happened, The obvious question isn't how did Thomas communicate with Ken? The question is who punched the hole? And that's where 2109 seems to enter the story even more so, which is even more interesting. So some of the communications attributed to 2109 suggest that Ken and the others may have been participating in something experimental. And this is the point where the story begins sounding almost like science fiction. I think we have to acknowledge that. Any extraordinary claim needs extraordinary evidence. And the evidence available publicly does not allow us to establish that people from different centuries actually communicated. But stay inside the story for a moment, because there's a disturbing implication. What if Ken wasn't supposed to understand what was happening? What if Thomas wasn't supposed to understand either? Imagine scientists studying two laboratory animals separated by a transparent barrier. The animals begin interacting. They think they've discovered each other, but neither understands that the researchers intentionally placed them together. Now replace the animals with two human beings and replace the transparent wall with 400 years. Ken thinks he discovered Thomas. Thomas thinks he discovered Ken, but maybe neither discovered anything. Maybe they were introduced. And if so, by whom? 2109 or one, the one other person that says one, O-N-E, some other intelligence, for what purpose? Maybe the experiment wasn't testing communication. Maybe it was testing them. How does a 20th century human react when confronted with apparently impossible information? How does a 16th century human react? How quickly do they believe? How quickly do they distrust? There's so much information. Now, and then comes the most disturbing possibility. What happens if something does change? Now, you probably, the butterfly effect, you've probably heard of this, right? The basic popular idea is that an extremely small change in one part of a complex system can eventually contribute to an enormous differences later. So time travel fiction loves this concept. So you go, in other words, you go back in time, you move one object, you accidentally prevent two people from meeting, the child is never born. That child's descendants never existed. History changes. But the Dodleston situation would create a more subtle problem. Ken doesn't need to physically travel to 1541. Information alone could change history. Suppose Ken tells Thomas something about the future. Thomas acts differently because of it. That changes what Thomas does. Maybe it changes where he goes, who he meets, what he says, what he writes. Now history has potentially changed because of information that came from history's own future. That creates a paradox. Where did the information originate? Imagine Ken discovers a poem written in 1541. He sends the poem to Thomas. Thomas likes it. Thomas writes it down. 400 years later, Ken finds a copy of Thomas's poem. Who wrote the poem? Ken got it from Thomas. Thomas got it from Ken. There's no original author. The information exists inside a loop. So physics and philosophy can call related puzzle bootstraps paradoxes or casual loops. And if the Dodleston correspondence are genuine, that kind of problem could become very, very relevant, because once Ken began researching Thomas, information could potentially circle between the historical record and the person who supposedly created that record. Maybe that's why 2109 became concerned. Or maybe that's simply part of the mythology created around the case. Either way, it's a brilliant problem. And it raises another frightening possibility. What if Ken changed something and never knew? How could you detect a changed timeline from inside the changed timeline? You couldn't compare it with the original. Your memories might be part of the new history. Your books would contain the new history. Your records could contain the new history. This could be catastrophic. Now, yeah, it's pretty fascinating, isn't it? As if that's not enough. At various points, the problem comes where Thomas disappears. Thomas is in 1541, remember. His name is Lucas, originally. We find out his real name is Thomas. At various points in the correspondence, communication with Thomas reportedly became uncertain, interrupted. Now imagine how disturbing that would be after months of contact. You're used to the messages. You develop a relationship with this person, then nothing. You send something, no response. Another message, nothing. And you ask yourself, these questions. Did the connection fail? Did Thomas lose access to the device? Did someone take it? Was he arrested? Was he injured? Did he just stop communicating? Silence becomes terrifying when you've been communicating with someone whose fate you may theoretically be able to research. And Ken reportedly continued trying to understand who Thomas actually was. So the historical investigation became increasingly important because if you could prove that a man matching Thomas's identity lived in the area during the 16th century, that would be extraordinary. Now, got to be careful though. You'll encounter claims online saying Thomas Hardin was conclusively found in historical records. Well, the situation is not that simple. There have been attempts to connect names, locations, historical references with communications. Nothing available establishes beyond reasonable doubt that the communicator was a verified historical individual corresponding exactly to the person described in the messages. That's important because otherwise we would turn an intriguing mystery into misinformation. We don't need to do that. The story is strange enough. But imagine Ken conducting that research in real time. Every old document becomes potentially explosive. Every name matters, place matters. You're searching through the history for someone who, according to the messages, might currently be sitting on the other side waiting for the answer. That's bizarre. Because normally historical research is emotionally safe. The people you're researching have passed away already. Here, Ken was supposedly researching a man who didn't know he was history yet. Now the sheriff. The communication took another strange turn. Someone claiming to represent authority in Thomas's period apparently became involved, and the exact wording and titles, it varied. Like I said, the core allegation is that Thomas's activities had attracted suspicion. Think about what that means from Thomas's perspective. He has this device, messages appear through it. He's been communicating with invisible people, and now somebody else knows. There's an intrinsic fear in that situation. Someone has discovered your secret, and you don't know how much they know. Imagine Thomas being questioned. Who are you communicating with? People from the future. How? I don't know. Who gave you this device? I don't know. What's their purpose? I don't know. I mean, that could be nightmare because there's no explanation available to him that sounds reasonable. Remember the period we're talking about, the reign, Henry VIII. Religion tensions are enormous. England, remember, has broken with Rome. So the dissolution of the monastery has been transformed communities. You can't just simply say, well, it's paranormal. That's pretty serious. Now, the other side goes quiet. Imagine that. Suppose for the past year, you've been receiving messages from someone every few days. You've never met them physically. You've never heard their voice. You've never seen their face. But you've gotten to know them. You know when they're angry or you've gotten their sense of humor. You recognize when they write. You know when something is wrong. Then one day the messages just stop. And at first you wait, maybe tomorrow. Tomorrow comes, nothing. A week, nothing. And like losing contact with somebody today, you can't call anybody. You can't go to their house. It's a helpless feeling. And that may be one of the loneliest ideas, I think, in this entire story. Ken could theoretically know where Thomas was. He could potentially stand in the same physical location, but Thomas was unreachable because the distance wasn't measured in miles. It wasn't measured in centuries. Now, meanwhile, the physical disturbances in the cottages allegedly continued. Objects reportedly moved. So they got some more paranormal activity occurring. It's crazy. We don't know why. And that leads to a fascinating, skeptical paranormal middle ground. What if nobody was communicating across time? But Ken and others were somehow generating the phenomena themselves, not deliberately, unconsciously. The messages, the dreams, the disturbances. It'd be extraordinary, wouldn't it? I don't know. Maybe is it time travel? Maybe was it a hoax? I don't know, but it's kind of crazy. And this is a crazy. The story gets even even more odd. So there was a hypothetical particle proposed in the theoretical physics that would travel faster than light. In other words, it's an important word, hypothetical. So there's these physics prove that the Dodleston messages could have worked through these particles of light and some of this. I just, if you understand that, I disagree with this. That doesn't make any sense. But I didn't really spend a lot of time with that because that is a theory that I don't think holds weight. So the messages have stopped completely. Computer off, experiment off, because once the thing on the other end starts telling you that your actions have consequences, as we left off, curiosity has to give way to caution. But Ken continued. I understand why. I mean, if this were happening to you, you go to work, someone complains about paperwork, someone talks about what they're having for dinner. Meanwhile, you're thinking, I may have spoken to someone living in the reign of Henry VIII last night. How do you go back to normal after that? I don't think you can. But 2109 apparently didn't want every answer discovered. And the communications contained warnings about what could and could not be revealed. Eventually, the question becomes unavoidable. If 2109 was genuinely concerned about preserving history, why initiate the communication in the first place? That's a contradiction. You can't open a doorway between centuries and then become surprised when people start exchanging information, unless the information exchange itself was the test. Maybe the objective was to see whether Ken obeyed. Maybe it was to see whether Thomas obeyed. Maybe somebody wanted to know what human beings would do when offered forbidden knowledge. If that sounds familiar, it should, because the story is much older than computers. I mean, human beings have been telling versions of it for thousands of years. Someone offers knowledge, there's a boundary, there's a warning, don't cross it, we cross it anyway. Now, eventually another alleged element happens in the Dodleston material that complicates everything as if it's already not complicated, because the communication was not always confined neatly to Thomas in the past and the 2109 somewhere else. There were indications that information might be moving through multiple levels of the phenomena. And some of the messages appear to know things about the participants themselves. And that's when a paranormal experience becomes personal. Look, it's one thing for something to say, I am Thomas Harden. It's another for it to demonstrate awareness of you, your conversations, your fears, your actions, your private life. And according to Ken's account, the phenomena increasingly seemed intertwined with the people investigating it. Now imagine being alone in the cottage late at night. The computer is turned off. The screen is dark. You know intellectually that's a machine, plastic, metal, circuit boards, nothing mystical. Then you remember the messages. Thomas, 2109, the warnings. You look at the screen, nothing. For some reason, you're almost afraid to turn it on, because there are two possibilities. Nothing will be there or something will. And strangely, you don't know which possibility frightens you more. Because if nothing appeared, maybe Thomas is gone. But if something does appear, then you have to answer it. And what if the next message isn't from Thomas? What if it's from 2109 or worse? What if it's from someone that you've never even heard from before? Someone who knows exactly who you are. That is essentially the psychological terror that Ken describes. The computer stopped being a tool. It became a doorway. And every time he turned it on, he didn't know who was coming through the other side. In essence, it became a portal. At some point, you have to ask yourself something very basic. If Thomas is really living in the 16th century, where is his computer? He obviously doesn't have one. He shouldn't have anything remotely resembling one. Yet, according to the story, he is somehow seeing and responding to text. That means there is an interface on his side, and Thomas describes something mysterious, something resembling a box or a device, something associated with an enigmatic figure called One, who gave it to him, remember? And we're back to the most important character in the story, not Thomas, not Ken, not 2109. The person or intelligence responsible for creating the connection. Because whoever provided Thomas's side of the interface would need access to technology centuries beyond Thomas's world, maybe centuries beyond Ken's. And they would need to know exactly where Thomas was, exactly where Ken was, exactly where both men existed. Think about the precision involved. 400 years of history, billions of human lives, countless locations, and somehow Thomas Hardin and Ken Webster connect. Same general place, different centuries. The coordinates are somehow implemented into a perhaps maybe a machine. This device, Ken has a device. Ken has electricity. Thomas is not. Now Thomas has a machine that can connect to Ken's device. Doesn't feel random. Ken then discovers Thomas. Someone selected them, which means the haunting wasn't attached to the cottage at all. The computer wasn't haunted. Thomas wasn't haunting Ken, and maybe nobody was haunting anybody. Maybe the cottage was simply the meeting point, a coordinate, and somebody else arranged the meeting. And that possibility brings us directly to the darkest part of the Dodleston story, because Ken eventually wanted to know who 2109 really was. And what they wanted, according to the communication, the answer was not simply, we're the people from your future. The implication was much stranger. They suggested that reality itself might not work the way Ken thought it did. That time might not be a river carrying us from past to future. That events separated by centuries might coexist in ways we don't perceive. That human consciousness might be capable of interacting with that structure. But if that's true, then we have a problem. Because if consciousness can somehow reach across time, then perhaps the dead aren't necessarily coming back. Maybe what people call ghosts are something else entirely. Maybe when someone sees a figure wearing a Victorian clothing walking through a hallway and disappearing through a wall, that person isn't seeing a dead Victorian person. Maybe for a few seconds, two moments occupied the same space. Maybe the Victorian person saw you too. And maybe somewhere in 1880, someone ran downstairs terrified and told their family, I just saw a strange person standing in the hallway wearing clothes I've never seen before. And their family told them, oh, you saw a ghost. What if both people were right? That's the possibility hidden inside the Dodleston Messages. Fascinating, isn't it? Maybe hauntings aren't always the dead visiting the living. Maybe sometimes time itself is haunted. And if that's true, then the question isn't whether Thomas Hardin was dead. The question is whether 1541 is ever truly gone. Because somewhere inside whatever time actually is, Thomas might still be sitting beside that strange box, reading words appearing in front of him, words written by a man who won't be born for centuries more. And perhaps maybe from Thomas's perspective, Ken Webster is still there too. Which leaves us with one disturbing thought before we move to the final. Right now, somewhere in your home, are you ready? Turn the lights down low. Right now, somewhere in your home, there may be a place where someone stood 400 years ago, or where someone will stand 400 years from now. Same coordinates, different motion. You can't see them. They can't see you. Normally, that's the end of it. But what if something found a way to connect those moments? And what if the Dodleston Messages weren't the first time it happened? What if they're simply one of the rare occasions when someone noticed? See, we got to investigate the part of the story. I think it's interesting. We need to stop listening to Thomas. We need to stop listening to 2109. And we need to start investigating Ken, who had access to the computer. Could these messages have been fabricated? Was the supposedly Tudor English actually Tudor English? Did Thomas Hardin really exist? Could someone have manipulated the BBC Micro? Because, in fact, oh, look, this is one of the strangest paranormal stories ever. Now, pretty fascinating, huh? So now we have to do something. Thank you very much. Now we have to do something every good paranormal investigator usually does. You know, we've heard this up and down. Could the computers have been manipulated? The BBC Micro was not some magical sealed device. It was a computer. Computers can be manipulated. Files can be created. Text, programs, disks can be changed. But really, not like this. I looked at it, and I think there's so many issues with it. I think one of the most famous elements of the Dodleston Messages is the archaic English. Anyone can write something like, "Thou art mistaken, good sir." That sounds like old-fashioned English. But the fact of the matter is the whole entire conversation was detailed conversations in that language. It's one thing to say, well, you can have a sentence or two. This was a whole conversation. I mean, really, why did Thomas sound so convincing? People who read the story often say that Thomas feels real, and I understand what they mean. He doesn't just seem like a collection of spooky messages. He appears to develop a personality. He becomes frustrated, misunderstands things, reacts. That's not a computer. That's a human mind. And that's what I think is very interesting about this case. Do I think Ken Webster create this whole entire thing? No, I don't. And even Debbie, if Debbie genuinely witnessed events independently of Ken, then we even have more than one person involved. And there is nothing at all that they would have, no ulterior motive. And Thomas Harden, if someone believing to live in the 16th century gives you a name, you obviously want to know if that person existed. This is where the story becomes almost irresistible. Imagine going through historical documents looking for someone you spoke with the previous night. You find an old name, you stare at it, and suddenly history stops feeling dead because the person that you have spoken to lived in your home in 1541. That's a problem. Now, just let that sit for a little bit. I don't think this was a hoax. Could it be automatic writing? There isn't another explanation. What if Ken was creating some of the material without fully recognizing what he was doing? Psychology has documented some forms of automatic behavior. I disagree with that. That would mean that he would have to have known it was a hoax, and he was not involved in the paranormal at all. And the physical events, the objects moved, the paranormal activity occurred. The argument is that perhaps the paranormal activity isn't paranormal. I guess in its set, it could be, in fact, Thomas Lucas moving the items. He's living there. 2109 transforms the entire case because if you remove 2109, we have something like a haunting with technological elements, an old house, historical figure, computer messages, poltergeist, strange dreams. Then 2109 arrives and suddenly the story becomes cosmic, time, dimensions, experiments, control, etc. But what if 2109 wasn't human? Let's entertain that possibility. Not because we know it's true. We don't know. Well, because that's where the story gets interesting. 2109 wasn't simply a person from the future. Suppose it wasn't even human. Suppose it was some kind of intelligence capable of observing multiple points in time. If so, Thomas and Ken might have looked very different from 2109's perspective. To us, Thomas is 4 centuries away. To 2109, maybe he isn't. Think about how we look at a road map. You can see the town you left this morning. You can see where you are now, and you'll see where you'll be tonight. All 3 locations exist simultaneously on the map, right? You're experiencing sequentially because you have traveled between them. But the map doesn't. What if time is something like that? What if 2109 could look at 1541 and 1985 the way you look at 2 towns on a map? To us, centuries. To 2109, coordinates. If so, connecting Thomas and Ken might be no more difficult than connecting 2 telephone numbers. And then 2109's attitude makes sense. Thomas is a maid, Ken's is a maid, 2109 is not. Maybe that's what it is. Perhaps if you want to argue, is it a ghost? I don't think so. I think this is a fascinating story. In the end, I wish I could tell you the final solution, the final answer, because the activity eventually stopped and the conversation stopped. What happened? We don't know. Will we ever know? We don't know. But here's what we do know. We know that something happened in this cottage where Ken, who was a teacher, who was not a paranormal enthusiast at all, had this profound experience with this Thomas, Lucas, and 2109, and no answers. No conclusive answer. Is 2109 something from the future, an artificial intelligence capable of actually coordinating two individuals who live in the same coordinates, same area, and able to connect them somehow using electronic device? Perhaps, maybe. Maybe, perhaps Thomas is existing right now. Or perhaps maybe that later on tonight, when you turn on your computer and then something says hello on your word process, in your Word document, and you're like, oh, no, turning it off. Turning that sucker off. But that's a fascinating story. Fascinating story. For those of you listening on some podcasts, we say good night to you. Yeah, I tell you what, guys, boy, this hour and a half just flew by, didn't it? It is a fascinating, the theory is, it is a very, very interesting theory. I just see time is something, it is a construct, because like heaven exists outside of time and space. Heaven is not restricted to time or space. So can you, in fact, have a parallel, the arguments are, can you have a parallel universe where in one universe is 1541 and a person, or let's just say it's 1600, whatever. And right now it's 2026. And there is someone in a parallel universe in 1600 that's living on your land, perhaps maybe in a different house or a hut or whatever it might be. And there is some form of communication device that you have, and now this other person has in 1600, and now you're able to communicate with one another. Because the argument is that if there are parallel universes, then the timelines are radically different. There are some arguments that there is a 2026 in a completely different parallel universe. That, matter of fact, there are other James Longs who might be the president of the United States. There are some who would argue that there are other James Longs who might be who might be a doctor, a lawyer, or a homeless man in the year 2026 in a parallel universe. This is where when you start talking about the doppelgangers and all this other stuff, where it gets very, very interesting and paranormal and supernatural. But there is a legitimate argument that the parallel universes exist. And perhaps, ghosts are not ghosts at all. Maybe the veil between the timeline is becoming so translucent that we can actually get small glimpses of either the past or the future. Especially when these ghosts have an intellect and they know that you're there. I have had that many times where I've gone into a place, a haunted location, and this ghost, this spirit, that it was intellectual. It wasn't a demonic, it wasn't violent activity at all. And there was no feeling of demonic activity. There was a feeling of intelligence. It could communicate using devices. Many of you, if you're paranormal investigators, how many times have you said, okay, can you turn on this flashlight? And it turns it on. Turn it off. And it turns it off. Can you walk through the REM pod? It goes to the REM pod. It goes off. So perhaps, maybe, ghosts are not ghosts at all. Maybe they're just human beings living in a parallel universe. And somehow we get connected. We just don't know. Fascinating stuff. My friends, I want to remind you that in 20 minutes, we're going to pray. So please join us if you want to. And remember, friends, your value does not decrease based on someone's inability or refusal to see your worth. You're priceless. Don't let anybody tell you or convince you otherwise. Good night.